Hi, so in this video I want to talk about templating and React, and more broadly about the notion of separation of concerns. So the reason I want to talk about this topic is because when newcomers discover React, their first reaction is often to be a little bit put off by the way React mixes HTML and JavaScript, and that was definitely my own reaction as well. So React has this thing called Jsx, and Jsx is what lets you write basically HTML inside your JavaScript, and it's very common. Like you don't have to use it, but as you can see, it's very convenient to output HTML from your React components. So it's convenient, but it also reminded me of what we used to do with PHP, where you would output HTML with PHP or add like bits of PHP in your HTML, and everybody was like, oh, that's very bad, it hurts separation of concerns, blah, blah, blah. And now suddenly it's not bad anymore. So yeah, that was a bit weird to me when I first stumbled on React. And there's actually good reasons for that. But before we go into that, like I mentioned separation of concerns, and that's a term that as I understand it, means keeping your HTML, JavaScript, and CSS separated. The idea being that if you need to change one, that shouldn't affect the others. So, for example, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, before CSS, we had, inline properties. So, if you wanted to make an H3 red, you would not say class equals H3 class, whatever. You would say color equals red. And then if you have another H3, it also needs to be red. You would also say color equals red, and so on. As you can see, well, that meant a lot of duplicated code. That wasn't very flexible. And then once someone else wanted to make the H3 green instead of red, they had to go through the file, change every instance of red. It was a whole mess. So then CSS came along, and we were like, well, we're gonna separate everything with classes. So you wouldn't even say class equals red because you're still tying the class to the color red. Instead, you would say class equals my H3 class, or hopefully a better name than that. And then inside that class, you say color equals red. And the same thing applies with JavaScript, right? Before we had onClick, JavaScript, alert, do something, whatever. And then people come along and say, no, that's bad. Just give that a class. And then in your jQuery event or whatever, refer to that class to declare the event. And so that's what people meant by separation of concerns. And the funny thing is that React kind of goes back to the way things were originally. So in React, you would say onClick, so let's say this dot click handler, or whatever you call the click handler. So you would say that, and you would sometimes also use inline styles. So people are like, well, understandably a bit shocked, because it's like going back to things that we've been told were bad practices for years now. So the question is why, right? Why does React move away from having separate templates, separate HTML files, and kind of mixes everything together? Well, let's take a practical example. Let's say you have you want to display a post in your app, like a forum post with a title and a date. So you would have something like that. By the way, this is not any like specific templating syntax. It's just a generic pseudocode. So let's say there's a date. So now let's say I don't want to just output the date, but I want to use a little bit of formatting to show the date from now, like 3 days ago, 2 hours ago. So there's a JavaScript library called Moment we could use, and we could write something like that. But then this means that our template needs to understand JavaScript, right? Because, well, otherwise it wouldn't understand this expression. So, for example, in Meteor's original templating library called Blaze, or rather, Spacebars is the templating library and Blaze is the front-end framework. Well, you couldn't do that. You would have to say from now date, and then create a new file where you would say templates.post.helpers from now date is a function that returns this.date, so moment.this.date. As you can see, it's quite a bit of code. Sorry, hard to type and talk at the same time. It's quite a bit of code for something that's really simple in React. Like in React, again, it's just that, because React, like the key thing is React is JavaScript. So, even though it has this JSX kind of thing to can make it easier to produce HTML, it's still plain JavaScript inside any like curly brackets. So you can't do that. So yeah, already we see if we want to save ourselves from writing all that boilerplate, we see that we're moving towards what React does. And now, well, a moment is a library, and before, like the old way of doing things was to have just a lot of globals, so moment would be available anywhere throughout your app, but now there's modules, so it's much better to import the library whenever we need it. So now we also need to do something like import moment from wherever, from moment. And well, that's not HTML, right? That's not template code, so we can't have it in this file. So we need another file, and you can see how like things get complex when you kind of want to juggle all these different concerns. And that's where separation of concerns starts to hurt your productivity, because, well, okay, they're separated, but that means you need to handle them separately. On the other hand, in React, you can have this at the top of your file, and then react.create class or component post equals new class, and so on. And you can mix these things and keep everything that's related together in the same file, which is a huge productivity gain. Now, I've just made the case for React's approach, but that's not to say that the previous way of doing things with templates and separate files doesn't also have its good points. So, for example, if you want to do a loop in React, you have to use a map, which requires you to understand the map function itself, but also the concept of a function in JavaScript, the concept of arguments, of return values. And that's quite a lot to ask from someone who might not be a programmer. So it's true that if I give this file to a non-programmer, they'll probably have a harder time than if I were just to give them a spacebars file or a Haml file. That doesn't mean, of course, that designers can't learn React. They can learn JavaScript as well. But it's hard to argue that there's not like a slightly higher barrier to entry. And another concern that I had, for example, is that I work on an app called Telescope, which is kind of an open source hack and use like app, and we have themes. So it's very cool to be able to define a template or a component and then have people overwrite it with their own. So with the React way of doing things, well, if people were to override the video component, that means they would also need to make sure that they have all these functions, otherwise it might not work. So it starts being a bit harder to just give people a component and tell them to go crazy and customize it, because there's a lot more places where it can break. But thankfully, React actually does have some solutions for that. So one of them is something called functional stateless components. And it's basically a new syntax that lets you write components in a much more simple way, basically like this, as a function that takes in arguments or props and returns JSX code. So if we were to transform this into a functional stateless component, first of all, we would have to get rid of this somehow. And once we only have the render function left, we would have only keep this and have something that's almost like a template, but with all the advantages of React and the power of JavaScript behind it. So this actually inspired me to create a small hack of my own, which I called JavaScript or Jsx Templates. And all this does is define a new file extension in Meteor called JSXT for Jsx Templates, and it will, when it encounters the JSXT file, Meteor will take its contents and create a stateless functional component around it. So all it does is, if we go back here, that first function definition part, it adds that to the HTML and you get a component. So that works pretty well. And I also added support for just regular JavaScript code before, if you want to do that, or import something, you can do that before or even after the component, the JSX. And yeah, that works. I'm using it in the app right now. So, it goes to show that at least it's possible. Now, is it a good idea to do that? Probably not at this point, because you don't get that many benefits. Basically, you just save a few lines of codes. So it's probably not worth adding like a whole new file format to your app just for that. But in the future, who knows? Maybe in the future we could support both JavaScript and JSX, and why not CSS, all in the same file and all without any like complicated boilerplate. So I guess at the end of the day, what I want to say is that React might do things a little bit differently, but there's a good reason for it. And I think overall, it's probably a better way of doing things. So let me know what you think. If you can, give React a chance. And yeah, let's discuss this video in the comments.